Hello and welcome to another episode of A Brief History. Today's episode, Donkey Kong. Ready, set, go. Kyoto, Japan, 1981. After multiple failed attempts to gain success in the North American arcade market, toy and electronics company Nintendo was left with a large number of unsold arcade cabinets of their space shooter game Radar Scope. So in an attempt to both save money and continue their efforts in the still new and burgeoning gaming industry, Nintendo decided to simply rework these unsold cabinets into a new and different game. Where Radar Scope was a typical 1980 space shooter similar to Space Invaders and Galaxian, Nintendo's new project was conceived as an action game based around the Popeye comic strip series. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, Popeye the arcade game would allow the player to assume the role of the Sailor Man as he worked his way through various obstacle courses in order to save his beloved olive oil from his nemesis, Bluto. However, Nintendo were unable to secure the license for the Popeye brand, forcing Miyamoto to rework the game's plot and cast of characters into something more original. And these efforts eventually culminated into a tortured love triangle between a man, a woman, and a giant ape in what we now know as Donkey Kong, an action platform game released to the arcades on July 9th, 1981. A pioneer of both its genre and its entire industry, Donkey Kong told the story of a carpenter named Jumpman, who we now know as Mario, on a mission to rescue his girlfriend Lady, or Pauline, from the ferocious giant ape Donkey Kong. A plot that may sound simple by today's standards, but back in 1981 was revolutionary for simply existing. Donkey Kong was one of the very first video games to feature cutscenes and a complete narrative plot, two things which are impossible to imagine the industry without today. Mix this with a memorable cast of characters and some of the earliest examples of platforming in all of gaming, and Donkey Kong was a massive success as well as an instant classic, now remembered as one of the most important video games ever created. So in the midst of Donkey Kong's success, Nintendo began development on a sequel to their breakout hit, and while they could have simply made another Donkey Kong but with different levels, they decided to shake things up quite a bit with 1982's Donkey Kong Jr. DK Jr.'s plot was very similar to that of its predecessor, except now players took control of Donkey Kong's son Jr. in an attempt to save Donkey Kong, who was being held captive by Mario. But new storyline aside, the main difference between Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. was its gameplay focus. Where the original game's design was mainly based around jumping, DK Jr. focused much more heavily around climbing, a gameplay mechanic that would later become a staple of the franchise. So while not quite as revolutionary as the game before it, Donkey Kong Jr. still lived up to the lofty expectations of fans and garnered great success, even eventually seeing an educational NES spin-off title known as Donkey Kong Jr. Math. And I don't know whose mom came up with that idea, but gosh dang if they didn't deserve to get fired. But anyway, with Nintendo on top of the world virtually dominating the early gaming scene, they were once again ready to follow up with yet another Donkey Kong title, Donkey Kong 3, released to arcades in October of 1983. But where the changes in Donkey Kong Jr. made sense within the established Donkey Kong formula, Donkey Kong 3 bared little to no resemblance to either of the games that preceded it. This game featured no Mario, no complete narrative, and no platforming. Oh no. Donkey Kong 3 was a shooter in which you play as Stanley the Bugman, who must protect a set of plants from being infested by insects released by Donkey Kong. And you do this by simply spraying bug spray at both the bugs and at Donkey Kong, and once you've shot DK all the way to the top of the screen, that's it. You win, rinse and repeat. This was a massive departure from what was established in Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., and combining that with the game's unfortunate release date during the North American video game crash of 1983, Donkey Kong 3 was ultimately the least successful and least remembered game in the original Donkey Kong series. But despite DK3's failure, the original Donkey Kong arcade trilogy was still a monumental achievement for the gaming industry, with ports of all three games being seen on various different consoles and computers, and even seeing a side series of both ports and original games released as part of the Game & Watch line of handhelds. However, these games were all remakes and spin-offs. It would not be until over a decade later in 1994 that the world would see any new original Donkey Kong games. But man, when it rains, it pours, because this year saw the beginning of a whole new era for the Donkey Kong franchise, starting with Donkey Kong for the Nintendo Game Boy, also known as Donkey Kong 94. Released on June 28, 1994, Donkey Kong 94 started out with a slightly modified version of the original arcade game's 4 levels, but then gave way to an entirely new game that mixed the platforming style of DK and DK Jr. with the lifting and throwing mechanics of Super Mario Bros. 2. This approach earned Donkey Kong 94 very positive review scores, many considering it to be one of the best games on the original Game Boy. In fact, this game's influence was so strong that it later spawned an entire line of Donkey Kong games in a similar style, known as Mario vs. Donkey Kong. This side series of games began on the Game Boy Advance on May 24th, 2004, and has continued to this day on the Nintendo DS, 3DS, and most recently, the Wii U. But of all the titles we've covered so far, there has been one very common thread between every single game, and that is the fact that in none of these games do you actually get to play as Donkey Kong, except Donkey Kong Circus on the Game & Watch, but honestly, that barely counts. I'm sorry, DK Circus. I know, you were an integral part in proving that Mario has antisocial personality disorder, but you just aren't relevant. No, in every Donkey Kong game up to this point, you have only ever played as Mario or Donkey Kong Jr., never the ape himself. It would not be until November 25th, 1994 that gamers could finally play as the ape who changed gaming. Or at least the grandson of the ape who changed gaming, who shares the same name as the actual ape who changed gaming and is the son of the ape who changed gaming. It would not be until November 25th, 1994 that gamers could finally play as DK himself in the Super Nintendo classic Donkey Kong Country. Being the first true main series Donkey Kong game in 11 years, Donkey Kong Country aimed to revitalize the long-dormant franchise, bringing it up to speed with all of the changes and advancements that the industry had gone through since Donkey Kong 3. This series reboot was spearheaded by British development company Rareware and shared very little in common with its preceding arcade titles, ditching the established puzzle platforming formula in favor of a 2D side-scroller similar to the Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog franchises. However, what set Donkey Kong Country apart from its wealth of contemporaries was its clever and challenging level design, beautiful art direction and music, and most of all, its groundbreaking graphical prowess. Donkey Kong Country was one of the first home console games to use pre-rendered 3D graphics, a technique that involves using pre-made 3D sprites and models to build a pseudo 3D environment on a 2D plane, making Donkey Kong Country one of the most realistic looking games to ever exist at the time. All of these aspects combined to make Donkey Kong Country one of the best-selling and most critically acclaimed games on the Super Nintendo, pushing around 9 million units and almost single-handedly helping Nintendo edge out Sega during the infamous 16-bit console wars of the 1990s. And of course, no game as critically and financially successful as Donkey Kong Country could ever be just a one-off. On the contrary, DKC's release left gamers across the world clamoring for more, and needless to say, Rare and Nintendo were more than happy to oblige, releasing a myriad of sequels and spin-offs over the next few years. The first of these games was the 1995 Game Boy title Donkey Kong Land, which tackled the monumental task of bringing the colorful and graphically advanced DKC formula onto Nintendo's original black and white 8-bit handheld, pushing the limits of what the system was capable of. And following Donkey Kong Land's release that very same year, on November 20th, 1995, Nintendo released Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest for the Super Nintendo, which made the bizarre choice to ditch DK as a playable character in favor of Diddy Kong, who had previously been introduced in the original DKC, and another newcomer named Dixie Kong. And things got even weirder in Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, released for the Super Nintendo on November 22nd, 1996. Double Trouble took things one step further than Conquest, choosing to forego both Donkey and Diddy Kong while keeping Dixie, and introducing yet another new character, Kiddy Kong, who is just an utter abomination to the eyes. Both of these sequels perfectly maintain the style and feel of the original DKC while expanding on it with more varied level design and abilities. This earned both Conquest and Double Trouble incredibly positive reviews across the board, and both games received their own Donkey Kong Land variants on the Game Boy, which were also very well received. So to recap, after 11 years of complete silence between 1994 and 1997, the world was given a total of 7 Donkey Kong games, 3 on the SNES and 4 on the Game Boy. Not to mention that the 3 SNES games would later see ports on the Game Boy Advance and 1 port for the Game Boy Color, effectively creating one of the most beloved series of Nintendo games in recent history and putting Donkey Kong back on the map. But by the time Donkey Kong Country 3 released in 96, Nintendo would already release their next home console, the Nintendo 64. And suddenly, Donkey Kong Country's highly detailed 2.5D side-scrolling was greatly overshadowed by the fully realized three-dimensional gameplay of new titles like Super Mario 64 and even Crash Bandicoot, leading Rare to the decision that it was time for Donkey Kong to go full 3D. And 3 years later, on November 24th, 1999, this idea was finally realized in the monumental Donkey Kong 64. A somewhat later entry in the N64 lifespan, Donkey Kong 64 introduced barrels full of changes and new additions to the DK formula. First off, keeping with tradition, Rareware introduced a large cast of new playable Kongs, including the classic Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong, and newcomers Tiny Kong, Lanky Kong, and Chunky Kong. Every single one of these Kongs also came with their own weapons, musical instruments, power-ups, and personalized collectibles, and that was perhaps the biggest change found in DK64, the collectibles. You see, unlike Donkey Kong Country, which was based on constant quick-paced platforming, DK64 was cut from the cloth of another Rareware N64 title, Banjo-Kazooie, which was based around exploring and platforming through open-world 3D environments in order to collect items that were needed to progress. And when it came to collectibles, Donkey Kong 64 was stuffed in the rack! In fact, Rareware shoved so much content into DK64 that a 4MB expansion card had to be bundled with each unit just to make it all playable without the game breaking. And by expansion pack, I of course mean
that red thing is stuck in the N64.
But thankfully, in the end, all of this extra time and money was well worth the effort, for Donkey Kong 64 was released to critical acclaim and even set a Guinness World Record for the most collectible items in a video game. But unfortunately, 3 years following DK64's release on September 24th, 2002, the entirety of the Rareware company was bought out by Microsoft, meaning that Rare could no longer develop Donkey Kong games and leaving Nintendo unsure what exactly to do with their oldest running franchise. And thus we enter what I like to refer to as Donkey Kong's bongo era, a period between the years of 2004 and 2007 that saw a handful of very experimental Donkey Kong spin-off games that played around with various different forms of control. The main events of this era were 2004's Donkey Konga, 2005's Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, and a sequel to Donkey Konga that was also released in 2005. These three games were all released for the Nintendo GameCube and were played via a custom control peripheral known as the DK Bongos. And where Donkey Konga 1 and 2 were pretty traditional rhythm games and utilized the bongos as one would expect, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat was an old-school side-scrolling platformer allowing for much more creative implementation of the bongos. However, for those not interested in slapping and clapping, Jungle Beat did later see a bongo-less re-release for the Nintendo Wii in 2009. But outside of the home console world, Donkey Kong was also experimenting quite a bit on handhelds. In addition to the previously mentioned Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, which began during this time period, Nintendo and developers Payon also released DK King of Swing for the Game Boy Advance in 2005 and DK Jungle Climber for the Nintendo DS in 2007, both of which were puzzle platformer games controlled entirely with only the left and right shoulder buttons. All of these games received average to positive reviews, but they were all spin-offs. The main Donkey Kong series have been completely dormant since the release of Donkey Kong 64 in 1999, making this the franchise's second decade-plus long absence. But it was around this time in the late 2000s that the gaming scene began to undergo a few changes. For years at that point, 2D platformers had become somewhat of a lost art in the home console world, but slowly began to make a comeback thanks to the unprecedented critical success of New Super Mario Bros. On the Nintendo DS, as well as its Wii sequel. This ushered in a new era of retro revival that is still going on to this day, and arguably one of the biggest games to come out of this movement was the highly anticipated Donkey Kong Country Returns, released for the Nintendo Wii on November 21st, 2010. The first main series DK game since 1999 and the first in the Country series since 1996, Donkey Kong Country Returns was developed by Retro Studios, who had previously received critical acclaim from their work revitalizing another classic Nintendo franchise, Metroid. DKC Returns brought back virtually everything that made the original series so successful while leaving its own mark on the franchise with new styles of gameplay and a few formula tweaks here and there, such as Diddy Kong acting as a power-up rather than a playable character. And Retro's faithful nostalgic throwback resonated greatly with audiences, receiving critical acclaim with review scores averaging out at around a strong 8 out of 10, eventually leading to the game seeing a Nintendo 3DS port in 2013 and a Wii U sequel in 2014 known as Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now at the time of this recording, there has been no news of any upcoming Donkey Kong games, but based off the overwhelmingly positive reception of DKC Returns and Tropical Freeze, I'd say it's very likely that we'll be seeing more from this franchise sooner than later. At the time of its conception, Donkey Kong was absolutely revolutionary, and without it, who knows where the gaming world would be today. And between his various appearances in Mario Party, the Mario Sports series, various kart racers, and even TV shows and movies, Donkey Kong has solidified himself as a true gaming icon. One who has continually set the bar for all games to follow and almost single-handedly made this industry what it is today. And that is quite a big accomplishment for an ape. And speaking of apes, earlier in this episode I mentioned how the original Donkey Kong Country was one of the most realistic looking games of its time. The team at Rare went to great lengths to make DKC feel real, but that just begs the question, how close is Donkey Kong to a real-life gorilla? Well, the awesome YouTube channel Animalogic recently released a video on that exact topic, comparing and contrasting the DK we know and love to his real-life equivalent. It's a fascinating video that is chocked full of facts about gorillas and even a little bit of trivia on the development of Donkey Kong Country itself. So if that sounds interesting to you, you can click on this annotation to check out their video over on the Animalogic channel. I really think you'll like what you see, and if you do, you can always subscribe. So again, be sure to check out their video over on the Animalogic channel, and until next time, thanks for watching, guys. DFTBA.